Michael Thompson had always thought he knew his mother completely. At 28 years old, he believed there were no surprises left in Margaret Thompson's life that could shock him. She was a retired school teacher, lived in the same suburban house for 30 years, and kept to her routine of morning coffee, afternoon gardening, and evening news. She was predictable, safe, and exactly what Michael expected from a 72-year-old woman who had raised him alone after his father died when he was 12. That Tuesday afternoon in October changed everything Michael thought he knew about his mother. He had driven to her house on Maple Street to help fix her leaky kitchen faucet. The autumn leaves were scattered across her front yard, and her white Honda Civic sat in the driveway as usual. Michael used his spare key to let himself in, calling out as he entered. "Mom, I'm here about the faucet," he announced, setting his toolbox down in the hallway. Silence. This was unusual. Margaret always responded immediately when he arrived, usually appearing within seconds with a warm smile and an offer of fresh cookies or coffee. Michael walked through the living room, checking the kitchen, then the small den where she liked to read. Empty. He noticed her purse was gone from its usual spot on the kitchen counter, and her car keys weren't hanging on the hook by the door. She must have gone out and forgotten about their appointment. Michael pulled out his phone to call her, but then remembered she often forgot to charge it or left it at home entirely. Since he was already there, Michael decided to wait and work on the faucet anyway. He had just started removing the old fixtures when he heard voices outside. Through the kitchen window, he saw his mother walking slowly up the front path. She wasn't alone. Beside her was a young woman, maybe 18 or 19 years old, with tangled brown hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. The girl carried a worn backpack and moved with the cautious posture of someone who wasn't used to being welcomed anywhere. Most shocking of all, his mother had her arm around the girl's shoulders, guiding her gently toward the front door like she was bringing home a treasured guest. Michael quickly moved to the front window to get a better look. The girl was clearly homeless, her jeans had holes that weren't fashionable, her sneakers were held together with duct tape, and she kept looking around nervously as if expecting someone to tell her to leave. But Margaret was treating her with such tenderness, such care, that Michael wondered if he was seeing things correctly. He watched his mother unlock the front door and usher the girl inside, speaking to her in soft, reassuring tones. Michael couldn't make out the words, but the kindness in his mother's voice was unmistakable. As they entered the house, Michael heard the girl say something that sounded like "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Michael remained frozen by the kitchen window, unsure whether to announce his presence or continue observing. His mother had never mentioned knowing any homeless people, let alone bringing them into her home. Margaret Thompson was generous with her church donations and volunteer work, but she had always been cautious about strangers, especially after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood 2 years earlier. "Let's get you cleaned up first, sweetheart," Michael heard his mother say as they moved through the house. "The bathroom is right down this hall, and I'll find you some clean clothes." The girl mumbled something Michael couldn't hear, but his mother's response was clear and warm. "Nonsense, dear. Everyone deserves dignity and kindness. You just take your time." Michael heard footsteps going upstairs, then the sound of his mother moving around in what he knew was the spare bedroom. She was apparently gathering clothes for the stranger, treating her like a welcomed houseguest rather than someone she had just met on the street. 20 minutes later, Michael heard the shower running upstairs. His mother came back down to the kitchen and jumped slightly when she saw him standing there with a wrench in his hand. "Michael! I didn't know you were here already," she said, but there was something different in her voice. It wasn't guilt exactly, but a kind of careful measuring, as if she was deciding how much to explain. "I came to fix your faucet, remember?" Michael said, studying his mother's face. "Mom, who is that girl upstairs?" Margaret moved to the refrigerator and began pulling out ingredients for what looked like a substantial meal. "Her name is Emma," she said without looking at him. "She needed help." "Needed help how? Where did you meet her?" Michael pressed, setting down his tools. "Mom, you don't just bring homeless people into your house. It's not safe." His mother paused in her food preparation and turned to face him directly. In her eyes, Michael saw something he had never seen before, a mixture of determination and protectiveness that reminded him of how she had looked when defending him from bullies as a child. Emma is not homeless people, Michael. She's a young woman who has been dealt some terrible circumstances, and she needs someone to care about her welfare. I am perfectly capable of determining what is and isn't safe in my own home. The firmness in her voice surprised Michael. This wasn't the gentle, cautious mother he knew. This was someone who had made a decision and wasn't interested in being questioned about it. But, Mom, how do you even know her? Did you just meet her today? Michael asked, trying to understand the situation. Margaret returned to preparing food, chopping vegetables with more force than necessary. I've known Emma for 3 weeks, she said finally. I've been helping her gradually, and today she finally agreed to come inside and get properly cleaned up and fed. 3 weeks. Michael stared at his mother in complete confusion. For 3 weeks, she had been interacting with a homeless teenager and had never mentioned it once during their regular phone calls or weekly dinners. This was completely unlike the mother who shared every detail of her daily activities, from what she had for breakfast to which neighbor had gotten a new mailbox. Where have you been meeting her for 3 weeks? Michael asked. At the park downtown, near the library, Margaret replied, adding chicken pieces to a pan that was already heating on the stove. I go there sometimes to read, and that's where Emma spends her days. She's very polite and intelligent, Michael. She's just had some hard breaks in life. Michael watched his mother cook with an efficiency and purpose that suggested she had been planning this meal for some time. She wasn't just throwing together leftovers for an unexpected guest, she was preparing a thoughtful, nutritious meal for someone she clearly cared about. The shower upstairs had stopped running, and Michael could hear movement in the spare bedroom. His mother immediately went to the bottom of the stairs and called up, Emma, dear, take your time. Dinner will be ready in about 30 minutes, and there's no rush at all. A soft voice drifted down, thank you so much, Mrs. Thompson. I'll be down soon. Michael had never heard anyone call his mother Mrs. Thompson in casual conversation. Her friends called her Margaret or Maggie, family called her Mom or Grandma, and service people called her Ma'am. The formal address suggested a relationship that was respectful but not yet intimate, despite the obvious care his mother was showing. Mom, I need to understand what's happening here, Michael said, keeping his voice low so the girl upstairs wouldn't overhear. You've been secretly meeting with a homeless teenager for 3 weeks, and now you've brought her into your house. This is completely unlike you. Margaret finished seasoning the chicken and turned to face her son with an expression that was both patient and slightly disappointed. Michael, what exactly do you think is like me? Do you believe I'm the kind of person who would walk past a young woman in need and do nothing to help? The question caught Michael off guard. He had always seen his mother as kind and generous, but within safe, conventional boundaries. She donated to charities, volunteered at church functions, and helped neighbors with small favors. But directly intervening in the life of a homeless stranger seemed like a dramatic departure from her usual approach to helping others. I think you're someone who would want to help through proper channels, Michael said carefully. Like contacting social services or homeless shelters, not bringing strangers into your home. And what makes you think I haven't tried those proper channels? Margaret asked, stirring the chicken with more vigor than necessary. What makes you assume I would act impulsively without gathering information first? Again, Michael found himself without a good answer. He was realizing that he might not know his mother as well as he thought he did. The woman standing in front of him seemed more decisive and worldly than the cautious suburban retiree he had always believed her to be. Footsteps on the stairs interrupted their conversation. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing a clean pair of jeans and a soft blue sweater that Michael recognized as belonging to his mother. The girl had washed her hair, which was actually a pretty chestnut brown when clean, and the shower had revealed that she was younger and more fragile-looking than he had initially thought. This is my son Michael, Margaret said warmly, as if introducing them at a normal family gathering. Michael, this is Emma. Emma extended a thin hand toward Michael with obvious nervousness. Nice to meet you, she said quietly. Your mother is an amazing person. Michael shook her hand, noting how small and cold it felt despite the warm shower she had just taken. Up close, he could see that Emma was probably no more than 18, with large brown eyes that seemed much older than her years. There was something about her posture that suggested she was ready to flee at the first sign of conflict or unwelcome. "It's nice to meet you too," Michael managed, though his mind was still racing with questions and concerns. Margaret immediately moved to put Emma at ease, guiding her to a chair at the kitchen table and placing a glass of orange juice in front of her. "How are you feeling, dear? Better after getting cleaned up?" Emma nodded, wrapping her hands around the glass as if its warmth was precious to her. "Much better, thank you. I can't remember the last time I had a real shower with actual hot water." The simple statement hit Michael unexpectedly hard. Here was a girl barely older than some of his college friends, talking about hot water like it was a luxury she rarely experienced. Despite his concerns about his mother's safety, Michael felt a stab of sympathy for Emma's situation. "Where are you from originally?" Michael asked, trying to strike a conversational tone while gathering more information. Emma glanced quickly at Margaret before answering, as if checking whether it was okay to share personal details. Margaret gave her an encouraging nod. "I grew up about 2 hours north of here, in a small town called Millfield," Emma said. "But I've been on my own for about 8 months now." 8 months. Michael tried to imagine what could have happened to cause an 18-year-old to be homeless for 8 months, but the possibilities that came to mind were all troubling. He noticed that Emma hadn't mentioned her family or explained why she was on her own, and the careful way she had phrased her answer suggested there was much more to the story. Margaret placed a plate of food in front of Emma that was generous enough to feed 2 people. The chicken was perfectly cooked, accompanied by mashed potatoes, green beans, and a dinner roll that was clearly fresh from the bakery. Emma stared at the plate for a moment as if she couldn't believe it was really for her. "Go ahead, sweetheart," Margaret encouraged. "Eat as much as you want. There's plenty more." Emma picked up her fork with hands that shook slightly, whether from hunger, emotion, or nervousness, Michael couldn't tell. She took a small bite, then a larger one, and Michael could see her shoulders relax slightly as the warm food reached her stomach. "This is incredible," Emma said after a few minutes. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal like this since." She paused, then finished quietly, "since I was little." Margaret sat down across from Emma with her own plate, but Michael noticed she was barely touching her food. Instead, she seemed focused entirely on making sure Emma felt comfortable and welcome. This level of attentiveness and care was remarkable, especially for someone she had only known for 3 weeks. Michael grabbed his own plate and joined them at the table, though he found it difficult to concentrate on eating. The whole situation felt surreal, his predictable mother hosting a homeless teenager for dinner as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Emma was telling me about the book she's been reading at the library," Margaret said, clearly trying to include Michael in the conversation while highlighting positive aspects of Emma's character. "She's working her way through the complete works of Jane Austen." This surprised Michael. He had unconsciously expected a homeless teenager to have limited education or intellectual interests, but Emma immediately brightened when the topic turned to literature. "I've always loved reading," Emma explained. "The library is warm during the day, and they don't mind if you stay for hours as long as you're quiet and respectful. I've been reading everything I can get my hands on." "What did you think of Pride and Prejudice?" Michael asked, genuinely curious now. Emma's face lit up with enthusiasm. "It's brilliant how Austen shows that first impressions can be completely wrong. Elizabeth thinks Darcy is arrogant and cruel, but she's judging him based on limited information and her own prejudices. It made me think about how often people make assumptions about each other without really knowing the whole story." The insight was surprisingly sophisticated, and Michael found himself reassessing his own first impressions of Emma. She was clearly intelligent and thoughtful, not the stereotypical image of a homeless person that had formed in his mind. "Have you been able to continue your education at all?" Michael asked gently. Emma's expression became more guarded. "I finished high school, but college wasn't really an option for me. Maybe someday, though." Again, she offered just enough information to answer the question without revealing details about her circumstances. Michael was beginning to understand that Emma's situation was probably more complex and painful than he had initially assumed. Margaret seemed to sense that the conversation was approaching sensitive territory and smoothly changed the subject. "Emma has been helping me understand some of the challenges that young people face when they're trying to get back on their feet.
It's been quite educational for me." This comment gave Michael new insight into his mother's relationship with Emma.
It wasn't just charity or pity. Margaret seemed to genuinely value Emma's perspective and treat her as someone with important knowledge to share. As dinner continued, Michael found himself drawn into the conversation despite his initial reservations. Emma was articulate, polite, and surprisingly well informed about current events from her time spent at the library. She asked thoughtful questions about Michael's work as a software engineer and listened attentively to his answers. More importantly, Michael began to see why his mother had been drawn to help Emma. There was something genuinely likable about the girl, a combination of vulnerability and strength that made you want to see her succeed. She was grateful without being obsequious, and, despite her obvious hardships, she maintained a dignity that was impressive for someone so young. After dinner, Emma immediately offered to help with the dishes, but Margaret waved her away.
"Absolutely not, dear. You're a guest in my home. Michael and I can handle the cleanup."
As Emma went into the living room to look at some books Margaret had set out for her, Michael helped his mother clear the table. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't an impulsive decision on his mother's part. She had clearly been planning and preparing for this evening for some time. "Mom, how did this really start?" he asked quietly as they worked. "The whole story, not just the summary version." Margaret was quiet for a moment, rinsing plates with careful attention. "3 weeks ago, I was at the park reading when I noticed a young woman sitting alone on a bench about 50 feet away. She was there for hours, just sitting quietly, not bothering anyone. But she looked so thin and tired, and she kept checking a phone that was obviously dead." She paused, loading plates into the dishwasher with precise movements. "I watched her for about an hour, and she didn't move except to shift position occasionally. Finally, I walked over and asked if she needed help with anything. Most people would have asked for money or food, but Emma just said she was fine and didn't want to be any trouble." Michael continued listening as his mother explained how she had gradually built Emma's trust over multiple encounters, bringing extra sandwiches to the park and eventually learning more about the girl's situation. "She's been sleeping in different places, sometimes the shelter when there's space, sometimes in an abandoned building on the east side, sometimes just in the park if the weather's okay," Margaret continued. "She lost her job at a fast food restaurant 2 months ago when the location closed suddenly, and she's been trying to find new work ever since."
"What about her family?" Michael asked. Margaret's expression darkened slightly. "That's not my story to tell, Michael.
But I will say that sometimes young people end up on their own through no fault of their own, and sometimes going home isn't an option for very good reasons."
The implication was clear enough.
Emma's homelessness wasn't the result of poor choices or rebellion. Something serious had happened that had forced her to leave home and stay away. From the living room, they could hear Emma quietly turning pages of a book. Michael realized she was being deliberately quiet to give them privacy for their conversation, which showed a level of social awareness and consideration that impressed him.
"So what's the plan now?" Michael asked his mother. "Is she staying here tonight?"
"That depends on what Emma is comfortable with," Margaret replied.
"I've offered, but she's very independent and doesn't want to feel like she's imposing on anyone. We'll take it one step at a time."
Michael looked at his mother with new respect. She had approached this situation with more thoughtfulness and planning than he had given her credit for. Instead of acting impulsively, she had spent weeks building a relationship with Emma and understanding her needs before offering more substantial help. When they finished in the kitchen, they returned to the living room to find Emma curled up in Margaret's favorite reading chair with a copy of Sense and Sensibility. She looked up apologetically when they entered. "I hope it's okay that I started reading this," she said.
"I can put it back if you need me to."
"Of course it's okay, dear," Margaret said warmly. "That's what books are for.
In fact, why don't you take that one with you?
I've read it several times already."
Emma's eyes widened. "I couldn't take your book. What if something happens to it?"
"Then, we'll get another copy," Margaret said firmly. "Books are meant to be read and shared, not just collected on shelves." Michael watched this exchange with growing understanding of his mother's character. She wasn't just being charitable, she was treating Emma with the same warmth and generosity she showed to family members. The offer of the book wasn't about the monetary value, but about treating Emma like someone whose education and happiness mattered. As the evening continued, Michael found his initial concerns gradually being replaced by admiration for both his mother's compassion and Emma's resilience. The girl had clearly been through difficult experiences, but she had maintained her dignity, her intelligence, and her consideration for others. When it came time to discuss sleeping arrangements, Emma became visibly uncomfortable. "I really appreciate the dinner and the shower, Mrs. Thompson, but I don't want to impose any further. I can head back to the shelter and see if they have space tonight." Margaret shook her head firmly. "Emma, it's already dark outside, and you said yourself that the shelter might not have room. The spare bedroom upstairs is clean and comfortable, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need to." "I don't want to cause problems with your family," Emma said, glancing nervously at Michael. "I know this is unusual, and I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable." Michael realized that Emma was giving him an opportunity to object if he was going to. She was being considerate of family dynamics while also protecting herself from potential rejection. The maturity and social awareness she was showing impressed him again. "Emma, you're clearly important to my mother, and you seem like a good person who's dealing with a tough situation," Michael said. "If my mom wants to help you, then I support that completely." The relief on Emma's face was obvious, though she tried to hide it quickly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Both of you. I promise I won't be any trouble." "You're not trouble, sweetheart," Margaret said gently. "You're a person who deserves kindness and support, and I'm glad I can provide a small part of that." As Michael prepared to leave that evening, he found himself thinking about the assumptions he had made and how quickly they had been challenged. He had walked into his mother's house expecting to fix a leaky faucet and had instead discovered a completely new side of Margaret Thompson, one that was more courageous, more independent, and more willing to take meaningful action than he had ever imagined. At the front door, he hugged his mother goodbye and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Mom. What you're doing for Emma is really special." Margaret smiled, but there was something in her expression that suggested this was just the beginning of something larger. "Michael, there's more to this situation than you know yet. Emma is special, and she's been through things that would break most people. But she's stronger than she looks, and smarter than most adults I know." "What do you mean, there's more to it?" Michael asked. "Come back tomorrow evening for dinner," Margaret said. "I think Emma will be ready to share more of her story by then, and there are some things you should know about why this matters so much to me." Michael drove home that night with his mind spinning. His mother had clearly formed a deep connection with Emma, one that went beyond simple charity or kindness. The way Margaret had spoken about Emma's strength and intelligence, and her comment about there being more to the situation, suggested that this relationship had become genuinely important to his mother. He thought about Emma's careful way of speaking, her obvious education and intelligence, and the maturity she had shown despite being barely 18. There was definitely more to her story than he had learned so far, and he found himself looking forward to tomorrow's dinner with genuine curiosity rather than concern. Most importantly, Michael was beginning to understand that his mother was more complex and capable than he had ever realized. Margaret Thompson wasn't just a retired schoolteacher living a quiet suburban life, she was a woman who was willing to take meaningful risks to help someone in need, and who had the wisdom and patience to do it thoughtfully and effectively. As he pulled into his own driveway, Michael realized that his relationship with his mother was about to change in ways he couldn't yet predict. Tomorrow's dinner would bring new revelations, and he suspected that Emma's story was going to challenge his understanding of family, responsibility, and what it really meant to help someone in need. Michael arrived at his mother's house the next evening with a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy. The day at work had been difficult to get through as his mind kept returning to the previous night's revelations. He found himself genuinely curious about Emma's story and increasingly impressed by his mother's unexpected depth of character. The front door opened before he could knock, and Margaret appeared with a warm smile that seemed brighter than usual. "Perfect timing," she said, giving him a quick hug. "Emma's been helping me prepare dinner all afternoon, and I think you'll be surprised by what a wonderful cook she is." From the kitchen came the sound of quiet humming and the pleasant aromas of what smelled like homemade bread and roasted vegetables. Michael followed his mother inside and was greeted by a scene that struck him as remarkably domestic and peaceful. Emma stood at the counter kneading dough, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing one of Margaret's aprons over the same clean clothes from yesterday. "Good evening, Michael," Emma said, looking up with a genuine smile that was much more relaxed than her nervous expression from their first meeting. "Your mother has been teaching me her recipe for dinner rolls. I hope you don't mind that I've been taking up space in her kitchen all day." "Not at all," Michael replied, noting how much more comfortable Emma seemed in just 24 hours.
"It smells incredible in here."
Margaret beamed with obvious pride.
"Emma is a natural in the kitchen. She's been telling me about some of the cooking she learned from her grandmother before."
She paused, glancing at Emma, who gave a small nod of encouragement. Before her circumstances changed. Michael sensed this was the opening to the deeper conversation his mother had promised. As they worked together to finish preparing dinner, Emma began to share pieces of her story with an openness that surprised him. "I lived with my grandmother from the time I was 14 until she passed away last year," Emma explained as she shaped the dough into perfect small rounds. "My parents had some serious problems with addiction, and it wasn't safe for me to stay with them anymore. Grandma Rose took me in and gave me the most stable 4 years of my life." She placed the rolls on a baking sheet with careful precision, her voice remaining steady despite the emotional weight of what she was sharing. "She taught me to cook, helped me with my schoolwork, and made sure I graduated high school with good grades. She used to say that no matter what life threw at me, I could always take care of myself if I knew how to cook a proper meal and balance a checkbook." Michael watched Emma work as she talked, noting the confidence and skill she showed in the kitchen. These weren't the movements of someone who had learned to cook out of necessity during months of homelessness, this was someone who had been taught with love and patience by someone who cared about her.
"What happened after your grandmother passed?" Michael asked gently. Emma's hand stilled for a moment before she resumed shaping rolls.
"Grandma Rose had been renting a small house, and, when she died, the landlord wanted me out within 30 days. She didn't have much in terms of savings or property to leave me, most of her money had gone to medical bills in her final months." Margaret moved to stand beside Emma, placing a supportive hand on the girl's shoulder. "Tell him about the job you had," she encouraged softly. "I found work at a family restaurant about an hour away from where Grandma and I had lived," Emma continued. "The owner, Mr. Chen, was incredibly kind to me. He let me work extra hours, taught me more about cooking, and even said I could eventually work my way up to assistant manager if I stayed long enough." Emma slid the tray of rolls into the oven and turned to face Michael directly. "I rented a tiny studio apartment above the restaurant, and, for about 6 months, I thought I was going to be okay. I was saving money, learning new skills, and I felt like I was building towards something stable."
"What went wrong?" Michael asked, though he suspected he could guess from her current circumstances.
"Mr. Chen had a massive heart attack in March," Emma said quietly. "He survived, but the doctors said he couldn't continue working the long hours that running a restaurant requires. His adult children live in California, and they decided to sell the property rather than try to manage the business from across the country." Emma moved to check on a casserole that was baking in the oven, using the task to compose herself before continuing.
"The new owners had different plans for the building.
They wanted to convert it into retail space for a clothing store, so both the restaurant and my apartment were going to be demolished. I had 2 weeks to find a new job and a new place to live." Michael was beginning to understand the cascade of circumstances that had led to Emma's homelessness. It wasn't a story of poor choices or personal failures, it was a series of losses and changes beyond her control that had systematically eliminated her support systems. "I spent all my savings trying to find another place to live and work," Emma continued. "I applied everywhere within bus distance, but most places wanted references from previous landlords, and the few jobs I could find didn't pay enough to cover first month's rent plus security deposits. After 6 weeks of sleeping in my car and showering at truck stops, even my car broke down beyond what I could afford to repair." Margaret had been listening quietly, but now she moved to the refrigerator and began preparing a salad with perhaps more focus than necessary. Michael suspected this part of Emma's story was difficult for his mother to hear, even though she had probably heard it before.
"That's when I ended up here," Emma said.
"I had heard that this city had better resources for people in my situation, and I thought maybe I could find work and get back on my feet.
But it's been harder than I expected." "In what way?" Michael asked.
Emma pulled plates from the cabinet with practiced ease, clearly already familiar with Margaret's kitchen organization.
When you don't have an address, it's almost impossible to get a job.
Most employers want to mail you paperwork, or they require you to have a permanent address for their records.
And, when you don't have a job, you can't afford to rent a place that would give you an address.
It's like being trapped in a circle where you need one thing to get the other thing, but you can't get either one without already having both. Michael had never considered this practical catch-22, but it made perfect sense. He was beginning to understand why someone as intelligent and motivated as Emma could end up homeless despite their best efforts. The shelter system helps, but it's not designed for people to stay long-term, Emma continued. Most shelters only let you stay for a few days at a time, then you have to leave for a week before you can come back.
And the waiting lists for transitional housing programs can be months long.
Margaret looked up from her salad preparation.
Tell him about the job interview you had last week.
Emma's expression brightened slightly.
I did have a promising interview at a bookstore downtown.
The manager seemed really interested in hiring me, especially when I demonstrated how much I knew about literature and customer service. But when she asked for my address and I had to explain my situation, she said the store's corporate policy didn't allow them to hire people without permanent addresses.
Did she give you a chance to explain that you were actively working on finding housing?
Michael asked. I tried, but I could see in her face that she had already made up her mind, Emma replied. I think she was genuinely sorry about it, but she said her hands were tied by company policies. It's happened 3 times now with different employers.
Michael was struck by how matter-of-factly Emma related these setbacks.
There was disappointment in her voice, but no self-pity or anger. She seemed to understand that these rejections weren't personal attacks on her character, but rather systematic barriers that affected many people in her situation. The timer for the dinner rolls chimed, and Emma pulled them from the oven with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in a kitchen. The rolls were perfectly golden brown and filled the room with a wonderful aroma of fresh bread.
These look amazing, Michael said, and he meant it.
Where did you learn to bake like this? Grandma Rose owned a small bakery before she retired, Emma explained, carefully transferring the rolls to a basket lined with a clean kitchen towel. She taught me that baking is part science and part love. You have to follow the measurements precisely, but you also have to pay attention to how the dough feels and responds to your hands.
Margaret smiled as she watched Emma work. She's been experimenting with some of my recipes and improving them. Yesterday's cookies were the best I've ever tasted.
As they sat down to dinner, Michael found himself looking at Emma with completely new eyes. This wasn't a random homeless person his mother had impulsively decided to help. This was a young woman with specific skills, clear goals, and a strong work ethic who had been derailed by circumstances beyond her control. Emma has been helping me understand some things about myself, too, Margaret said as they began eating the meal Emma had largely prepared.
Yesterday, she asked me a question that I've been thinking about ever since.
What kind of question?
Michael asked.
Emma looked slightly embarrassed. I hope it wasn't too personal, Mrs. Thompson. I was just curious about your life. Tell him what you asked me, Margaret encouraged. Emma hesitated, then said, I asked her why she never remarried after your father died. She's such a warm, caring person, and she's obviously beautiful and intelligent. It seemed like she would have had opportunities for companionship. Michael realized he had never asked his mother this question directly, though he had certainly wondered about it over the years. After his father's death, Margaret had focused entirely on raising Michael and building her teaching career. He had always assumed she was too busy or too devoted to his father's memory to consider dating again. Margaret set down her fork and considered her answer carefully. Emma's question made me realize that I had convinced myself I was content with my quiet, safe life. I told myself that I had you, my teaching, my small circle of friends, and that was enough for a fulfilling life. She paused, glancing between Michael and Emma. But spending time with Emma these past few weeks has reminded me how much I missed having someone to nurture and guide. Being a teacher satisfied part of that need, but retirement left a bigger hole in my life than I had admitted to myself. Michael felt a complex mix of emotions hearing this. Part of him felt guilty that he hadn't recognized his mother's loneliness, and part of him felt grateful that Emma had somehow filled a need he hadn't known existed. It's more than just loneliness, though, Margaret continued.
Emma has reminded me what it feels like to make a real difference in someone's life.
When I was teaching, I could see the impact I was having on children's education and development.
But retirement made me feel like I was just existing, rather than contributing anything meaningful. Emma spoke up softly.
Mrs. Thompson, you've made more difference in my life in 3 weeks than most people have in years. You gave me back my sense of dignity and hope when I was starting to lose both of those things. The sincerity in Emma's voice was unmistakable, and Michael saw his mother's eyes brighten with tears she was trying to hold back.
What do you mean about losing your dignity and hope? Michael asked Emma.
Emma put down her fork and considered the question seriously. When you're homeless, even temporarily, people start to look at you differently. Store clerks watch you suspiciously, people cross the street to avoid walking near you, and you start to internalize the message that you're somehow less worthy of basic respect and kindness. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I started to believe that maybe there was something fundamentally wrong with me that kept landing me in these situations.
Maybe I wasn't trying hard enough, or maybe I was just destined to be unsuccessful no matter what I did.
Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Emma's hand.
But that's not true, and you know that now. I do know that now, thanks to you, Emma replied.
When someone like Mrs. Thompson, someone who is clearly intelligent and successful and good, treats you with genuine respect and kindness, it reminds you that your worth as a person isn't determined by your current circumstances.
Michael was struck by the wisdom in Emma's observation.
At 19 years old, she had insights about human dignity and social dynamics that many people never developed. Her difficult experiences had given her a perspective that was both mature and compassionate.
Emma told me something yesterday that I can't stop thinking about, Margaret said. Tell Michael what you said about invisible people.
Emma looked hesitant, but Margaret encouraged her with a nod. I told Mrs. Thompson that being homeless teaches you that most people are invisible to each other most of the time. When you're walking down the street or sitting in a public space, you start to notice how rarely people actually make eye contact or acknowledge each other's existence. She took a sip of water before continuing. But, when you're homeless, you become extra invisible. People work even harder not to see you because seeing you makes them uncomfortable. It's not necessarily because they're cruel people, it's because acknowledging homeless people reminds them that financial security isn't guaranteed for anyone. Michael had never thought about homelessness from this perspective, but Emma's observation rang true. He could remember times when he had deliberately avoided eye contact with people asking for money or help, not because he was unsympathetic, but because he felt guilty about his inability or unwillingness to help everyone in need.
What changed when you met my mother? Michael asked. Emma's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire appearance.
The first time Mrs. Thompson talked to me in the park, she looked directly at me and spoke to me like I was a complete person with thoughts and feelings and experiences worth knowing about. She asked about the book I was reading, not about how I had ended up on the bench. Margaret had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up.
I need to tell you both something important. Getting to know Emma hasn't just been about me helping her, she has helped me in ways she doesn't even realize.
How so?
Michael asked.
His mother stood up and began clearing plates, but continued talking as she worked. For the past 2 years, since I retired, I've been feeling increasingly irrelevant and useless. I wasn't needed in the classroom anymore. You have your own successful life and don't need daily mothering, and I felt like I was just taking up space in the world without contributing anything meaningful. She paused in her clearing to look directly at both of them. Emma reminded me that I have skills and knowledge and life experience that can genuinely help someone. She reminded me that nurturing and guidance are still valuable things I can offer, even if I'm not in a formal teaching role anymore.
Emma had been listening with obvious emotion.
Mrs. Thompson, you saved my life in ways that go far beyond providing food and shelter.
You reminded me that I'm worth caring about.
The weight of this statement hung in the air for a moment before Margaret responded. And you reminded me that I still have something valuable to give to the world. Michael was beginning to understand that the relationship between his mother and Emma was more complex than simple charity. they had found in each other exactly what the other needed at a crucial moment. Emma needed someone to believe in her worth and potential, and Margaret needed someone who could benefit from her nurturing and guidance.
So what happens next? Michael asked. What's the plan for moving forward?
Margaret and Emma exchanged a glance that suggested they had been discussing this question extensively. Emma is going to stay here while she gets back on her feet, Margaret said. She's already applied for several jobs using this address, and we've been researching some educational opportunities that might help her build on her interests and skills.
What kind of educational opportunities? Michael asked Emma.
There's a community college program in culinary arts that I'm really interested in, Emma replied, her voice becoming animated with enthusiasm. It's a 2-year program that includes both cooking skills and restaurant management.
The admissions counselor said I might qualify for significant financial aid given my circumstances.
Michael could see the appeal of this plan for Emma, but he was also concerned about the implications for his mother.
Mom, are you sure you're prepared for this kind of commitment?
Having Emma here is going to change your whole routine and lifestyle. Margaret smiled in a way that reminded Michael of how she had looked when he was young, and she was explaining something she was passionate about. Michael, I haven't felt this energized and purposeful in 2 years. Having Emma here doesn't feel like a disruption to my life, it feels like my life finally has meaning and direction again.
Emma quickly added, we've talked about boundaries and expectations, and I'm going to pay rent as soon as I have steady income.
This isn't a charity situation where I'm taking advantage of Mrs. Thompson's kindness, it's a mutual arrangement where we both benefit.
What kind of mutual benefits? Michael asked, still trying to fully understand the arrangement. Margaret answered this time.
Emma brings energy and companionship to a house that had become too quiet and empty. She's already improving my cooking, introducing me to books and ideas I wouldn't have discovered on my own, and giving me someone to mentor and support in a meaningful way. And Mrs. Thompson provides me with stability and guidance from someone who has successfully navigated adult responsibilities, Emma added. She's teaching me things about financial planning and life skills that I never learned because my family situation was so chaotic. Michael could see the logic and benefits of the arrangement, but he was still concerned about potential problems.
What if it doesn't work out? What if you have conflicts or one of you wants to make different arrangements?
Both women seemed to have anticipated this question. We've agreed to give it a 6-month trial period, Margaret explained. At the end of 6 months, we'll evaluate how it's working for both of us and make decisions about the future based on our actual experience rather than assumptions.
Emma nodded in agreement. And we've promised to communicate directly about any problems or concerns rather than letting issues build up.
Mrs. Thompson has already told me that honest feedback from both sides will be essential for this to work.
The maturity and thoughtfulness of their planning impressed Michael.
This wasn't an impulsive arrangement based on emotion, they had clearly spent considerable time discussing practical details and potential challenges. There's something else I want you to know, Margaret said, her voice becoming more serious. I've already updated my will to include provisions for Emma's education.
This announcement surprised both Michael and Emma. Emma looked particularly shocked.
Mrs. Thompson, you can't do that, Emma protested. You've already done so much for me, and you barely know me.
What about Michael and your other family obligations?
Margaret held up a hand to forestall further objections. I've set aside enough money to cover Emma's culinary school tuition and basic living expenses for 2 years.
It's not a huge amount in the context of my overall estate, and it represents an investment in someone's future that I believe in completely.
She looked directly at Michael. This doesn't affect your inheritance in any meaningful way, and I hope you understand why I felt this was important to do. Michael was quiet for a moment, processing this information. His initial instinct was to feel protective of his family's financial resources, but, as he thought about it, he realized his mother's decision made perfect sense. Actually, I think it's a wonderful thing to do, he said finally. Emma clearly has the intelligence and motivation to make excellent use of educational opportunities, and you're in a position to make a difference in her life that could have lasting positive effects.
Emma looked like she was about to cry. I don't know how to thank you for something like this.
No one has ever believed in my potential enough to make this kind of investment in my future.
You don't need to thank me, Margaret replied firmly. You need to succeed and build a good life for yourself. That will be thanks enough.
As the evening continued, Michael found himself completely reassessing his initial concerns about his mother's involvement with Emma. What he had originally seen as a potentially dangerous impulse was actually a carefully considered decision that was benefiting both women in profound ways. Emma wasn't taking advantage of his mother's kindness, she was providing companionship, purpose, and energy that Margaret had been missing since retirement. And Margaret wasn't simply being charitable, she was making a strategic investment in someone whose success would validate her own continued ability to make a positive difference in the world. More importantly, Michael was seeing a side of his mother he had never fully appreciated. Margaret Thompson wasn't just the quiet, predictable suburban retiree he had imagined her to be. She was a woman with deep reserves of courage, wisdom, and generosity who had been waiting for the right opportunity to use those qualities in a meaningful way. As he prepared to leave that evening, Michael felt a sense of excitement about his family's future that he hadn't expected. Emma's presence in their lives was going to change things in ways he couldn't fully predict, but the changes seemed likely to be positive and enriching for everyone involved. "Mom, I need to apologize for my reaction yesterday," he said as Margaret walked him to the door. "I was making assumptions about Emma and about your judgment that weren't fair or accurate." Margaret smiled and patted his arm. "You were being protective of me, which I appreciate. But I hope you can see now that this situation is more complex and promising than it might have appeared initially." "I can definitely see that," Michael replied. "Emma is remarkable, and what you're doing for each other seems like exactly what you both needed." As he drove home, Michael reflected on how much his understanding of both his mother and Emma had evolved in just 2 days. He was beginning to suspect that tomorrow would bring even more revelations about the depth and significance of their relationship. Most importantly, he was starting to understand that his mother's willingness to open her home and heart to Emma wasn't just an act of charity, it was an act of wisdom that recognized how much both women had to offer each other. The relationship was built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and a shared understanding that sometimes the most meaningful connections come from the most unexpected circumstances. 6 months later, Michael barely recognized his mother's house when he arrived for their weekly Sunday dinner. The small front garden that had always been neat but unremarkable now bloomed with vibrant flowers and herbs that Emma had planted and tended with obvious care. The front porch, which had previously held only a single chair where Margaret occasionally sat with her morning coffee, now featured a comfortable seating area with cushioned chairs and a small table perfect for outdoor meals. But the most dramatic change was the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen as Michael approached the front door. For years, his mother's house had been quiet and peaceful, but now it buzzed with the energy of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. "Michael!" Emma called out as he entered, her voice carrying a warmth and confidence that had grown considerably over the past months. "Perfect timing as always. We just pulled the bread out of the oven." The kitchen had been transformed as well. New herbs grew in small pots on the windowsill, the counters displayed an array of cooking tools that hadn't been there before, and the whole space felt more alive and functional. Emma moved around the kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone completely at home, while Margaret sat at the table reviewing what appeared to be homework assignments. "How are the classes going?" Michael asked Emma as he gave his mother a hug. Emma's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Incredible! We're working on advanced sauce techniques this week, and I finally mastered the hollandaise sauce that's been giving me trouble. Chef Rodriguez said my knife skills have improved faster than any student he's ever taught." Margaret looked up from her papers with obvious pride. "She's at the top of her class in every subject. Her instructors keep commenting on how mature and focused she is compared to the other students." Michael wasn't surprised. Over the past 6 months, he had watched Emma blossom from an uncertain, fragile teenager into a confident young woman with clear goals and the skills to achieve them. The stability and support Margaret provided had given Emma the foundation she needed to rebuild her life, while Emma's presence had energized Margaret in ways Michael had never expected. "Tell him about the job offer," Margaret prompted. Emma blushed slightly but couldn't contain her excitement. "One of my instructors has connections to several high-end restaurants in the city,
and she recommended me for a part-time position at Meridian Bistro downtown.
They want me to start as a prep cook, but the head chef said if I continue to develop at my current pace, I could move up to line cook within a year.
That's fantastic, Michael said, and he meant it.
Meridian Bistro had an excellent reputation, and being hired there while still in school was a significant accomplishment. The best part is that the schedule works perfectly with my class schedule, Emma continued. I'll work Thursday through Sunday evenings, which means I can still be here for our weeknight dinners and help Mrs. Thompson with her projects during the week. Michael had learned that Emma and his mother had developed numerous shared activities beyond simple room and board. Emma helped Margaret with her volunteer work at the Literacy Center, Margaret assisted Emma with her business and finance coursework, and they had started a small catering business that provided meals for neighborhood gatherings and church events. Speaking of projects, show him what you two have been working on, Michael said, noticing a stack of professional-looking brochures on the counter. Margaret and Emma exchanged excited glances. We've been developing a proposal for a cooking program for at-risk youth, Margaret explained.
Emma had the idea, and we've been researching how to make it happen.
Emma picked up one of the brochures, which was elegantly designed and professionally printed. We want to create a program that teaches basic cooking skills to teenagers who are aging out of foster care or dealing with unstable housing situations. The idea is to give them practical life skills while also introducing them to potential career paths in the culinary industry. Michael examined the brochure, which outlined a comprehensive program including nutrition education, basic cooking techniques, food safety certification, and job readiness training. The proposal was thoughtful, well-researched, and clearly the result of considerable planning and effort. We've already had preliminary conversations with the community center downtown and 2 local restaurants that would be willing to provide internship opportunities for program graduates, Margaret added. The next step is to apply for grant funding and recruit volunteer instructors.
Michael was impressed by the ambition and scope of their plan.
This wasn't just a hobby project, it was a serious proposal for addressing real community needs in a sustainable way.
How did you come up with this idea? He asked Emma. Emma's expression became more serious.
During my time on the streets, I met a lot of young people who were in situations similar to mine. Many of them had never learned basic life skills because their family situations were chaotic or they had been in institutional care. Something as simple as knowing how to prepare nutritious meals on a limited budget could make a huge difference in their ability to maintain stable housing and employment. She paused, organizing her thoughts. I also realized that the culinary industry can be a good path for people who don't have traditional educational backgrounds or family connections. It's merit-based. If you can cook well and work hard, you can succeed regardless of where you come from.
Margaret nodded in agreement.
Emma has insights into these issues that I never would have developed on my own, and I have the administrative and educational experience to help turn her ideas into practical programs.
We make a good team.
Michael could see that their partnership had evolved far beyond the simple helping relationship it had started as.
They were now genuine collaborators, each contributing unique strengths to shared goals that neither could have achieved alone.
There's something else we need to tell you, Margaret said, her tone becoming more serious.
Emma has been accepted to the Advanced Culinary Program at Johnson Culinary Institute for next year.
Michael knew this was one of the most prestigious culinary schools in the region.
Emma, that's incredible. Congratulations.
Emma smiled but seemed less excited than he would have expected.
Thank you. It's an amazing opportunity, and I'm grateful for it.
But it would mean moving 3 hours away and living on campus for 2 years. Michael began to understand why both women seemed somewhat subdued about what should have been purely good news. Over the past 6 months, they had become genuinely close, functioning more like family members than simply roommates or friends. We've been discussing what this means for our living arrangement, Margaret said carefully. Obviously, Emma's education and career development are the top priority, but we've both grown attached to this situation.
Emma spoke up quickly.
I don't want Mrs. Thompson to think I'm abandoning her after everything she's done for me. And, selfishly, I don't want to lose the stability and family feeling I've found here.
Michael could see the emotional complexity of their dilemma.
Emma's acceptance to culinary school represented the exact kind of success their arrangement was designed to promote, but achieving that success would disrupt the relationship that had made it possible.
Have you considered any alternatives? Michael asked.
Margaret and Emma looked at each other with expressions that suggested they had been hoping he would ask this question.
Actually, we have, Margaret said.
But we wanted to get your opinion before making any major decisions.
Emma took a deep breath before explaining. The Culinary Institute has a satellite program here in the city that offers the same curriculum as the main campus. It's designed for working adults, so classes are scheduled in the evenings and weekends. The program takes slightly longer to complete, but graduates receive the same certification. The advantage would be that Emma could continue living here while pursuing her advanced education, Margaret added. And she could keep working at Meridian Bistro, which would give her practical experience to complement her classroom learning. Michael could see the appeal of this arrangement, but he wanted to make sure Emma wasn't sacrificing opportunities for the sake of convenience. Emma, is the satellite program genuinely as good as the main campus program?
You shouldn't compromise your educational goals just to maintain current living arrangements.
Emma's response was immediate and confident.
I've researched it extensively, and the satellite program actually has some advantages for my specific goals. Because it's designed for working students, there's more emphasis on real-world application and business skills. And staying in this city means I can continue building relationships with local restaurant owners and suppliers. Margaret added, we've also talked about how this arrangement would allow us to continue developing our youth cooking program. If Emma were away at school for 2 years, we'd have to put that project on hold indefinitely. Michael was beginning to see that their decision wasn't just about maintaining personal comfort, it was about preserving a partnership that was producing benefits for the broader community. There's one more thing, Emma said, her voice becoming slightly hesitant. Mrs. Thompson has suggested that we formalize our arrangement in a way that would give me more security and legal standing.
Michael looked to his mother for clarification.
I want to legally adopt Emma, Margaret said simply. She's become like a daughter to me, and I want her to have the family security she's never had.
The statement hit Michael with surprising emotional force.
He had watched his mother and Emma grow closer over the months, but he hadn't expected their relationship to develop into something this profound.
Emma, how do you feel about this? He asked.
Emma's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady.
It would mean everything to me.
I haven't had a real family since my grandmother died, and Mrs. Thompson has given me more love and support than I ever imagined possible. But I also don't want to create any problems for you or make you feel like I'm trying to take advantage of your mother's generosity. Michael looked at both women and realized that his initial concerns about his mother's involvement with Emma had been completely misplaced. This wasn't a situation where someone was being taken advantage of, it was a genuine family relationship that had developed organically based on mutual affection, respect, and shared values.
I think it's a wonderful idea, he said, surprised by how emotional his own voice sounded.
Emma, you've brought out the best in my mother and given her a sense of purpose and joy that I hadn't seen in years. And, Mom, you've literally saved Emma's life and given her opportunities she never would have had otherwise. He paused, looking directly at Emma. If my mother wants to adopt you, then, as far as I'm concerned, you're already part of our family.
Making it legal just recognizes what's already true.
Both women were crying now, and Michael found himself getting emotional as well. The relationship that had started with his mother bringing home a homeless stranger had evolved into something beautiful and meaningful for everyone involved. There's one practical consideration we should discuss, Margaret said after they had all composed themselves.
The adoption would mean that Emma would eventually inherit a portion of my estate along with Michael.
I want to make sure you're comfortable with that arrangement.
Michael didn't hesitate.
Mom, your money is yours to do with as you see fit. And, honestly, knowing that Emma will be taken care of and that she'll be there to look after you as you get older gives me peace of mind that I wouldn't have otherwise.
Emma shook her head firmly. I need to be clear about something. I'm not doing any of this for financial reasons. Mrs.
Thompson has already done more for me than I could ever repay, and I would be honored to be her daughter even if it meant no inheritance at all. I know that, sweetheart, Margaret said gently.
That's exactly why I want to make sure you're provided for.
You've proven beyond any doubt that your motives are pure, and now I want to make sure you have the security and belonging that you deserve." As they sat down to dinner that evening, Michael reflected on how dramatically his understanding of family had expanded over the past 6 months. Emma wasn't connected to them by blood or legal adoption yet, but she had become as important to his mother as he was, and increasingly important to him as well. More significantly, he had learned that his mother was capable of far more courage, wisdom, and love than he had ever imagined. Margaret Thompson hadn't just rescued a homeless teenager, she had found a way to create meaning and purpose in her retirement while launching a young woman toward a successful future. "I have an announcement too," Michael said as they began eating the meal Emma had prepared. "Sarah and I are engaged, and we want you both to be deeply involved in the wedding planning." Margaret clapped her hands together with delight, and Emma immediately began asking excited questions about the proposal and wedding plans. As the conversation flowed around the table, Michael realized that his family had grown in the most unexpected and wonderful way. "Sarah specifically asked me to invite Emma to be a bridesmaid," Michael continued. "She said that anyone important enough to my mother to adopt should definitely be included in our family celebrations." Emma looked stunned. "Are you serious? You really want me to be part of your wedding?" "Emma, you're going to be my sister," Michael said simply. "Of course we want you to be part of our wedding." The rest of the evening passed in a happy blur of wedding planning, career discussions, and family storytelling. As Michael prepared to leave, he realized that his weekly dinners at his mother's house had become the highlight of his week in a way they never had been before Emma's arrival. "Thank you," he said quietly to Emma as Margaret was getting their coats. "For everything you've done for my mother, and for becoming the sister I never knew I wanted." Emma hugged him tightly. "Thank you for accepting me and for raising no objections when your mother decided to take in a random homeless girl. I know that couldn't have been easy for you initially." As Michael drove home that night, he thought about the chain of events that had led to this unexpected expansion of his family. If his mother had been less compassionate, if Emma had been less worthy of that compassion, if either of them had been less willing to take emotional risks, none of this would have happened. Instead, his mother had demonstrated a level of wisdom and courage that had transformed not just Emma's life, but her own life and his life as well. Margaret Thompson had seen past Emma's circumstances to recognize her potential, and Emma had proven worthy of that recognition in every possible way. 6 months later, Michael stood at the front of a church watching his mother walk down the aisle escorted by Emma, who was radiant in a bridesmaid's dress and glowing with the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. The adoption had been finalized 2 months earlier, and Emma had started her advanced culinary program with the same determination and success she brought to everything else. Their youth cooking program had received its first round of grant funding and would begin accepting students in the fall. Emma continued to work at Meridian Bistro, where she had been promoted to line cook ahead of schedule. Margaret had never seemed happier or more energetic, and their house had become a gathering place for friends, neighbors, and family in a way it never had been before. As Michael exchanged vows with Sarah, he caught sight of his mother and Emma sitting together in the front pew, both crying happy tears. The homeless girl his mother had brought home had become the daughter and sister none of them had known they needed, but all of them treasured beyond measure. The story that had begun with Michael's shock at seeing his mother lean on a homeless girl had evolved into a beautiful demonstration of how love, courage, and wisdom could transform lives in ways that seemed almost magical. Emma Thompson, for that was her name now, had grown from a scared, homeless teenager into a confident young woman with a bright future and a loving family. And Margaret Thompson had proven that retirement didn't have to mean withdrawal from meaningful engagement with the world. Instead, she had shown that the later decades of life could be a time for taking on new challenges, forming new relationships, and making differences in ways that were just as significant as anything accomplished in earlier years. Most importantly, all of them had learned that family isn't just about blood relationships or legal documents, it's about choosing to love, support, and commit to each other through all of life's challenges and celebrations. The family that had expanded to include Emma was stronger, happier, and more complete than any of them could have imagined. Years later, when people asked Emma about how she had overcome homelessness and built a successful career, she would always credit Margaret Thompson with seeing her potential when she couldn't see it herself. And, when people asked Margaret about her decision to adopt a homeless teenager, she would always say that Emma had rescued her just as much as she had rescued Emma. Michael's initial shock at seeing his mother lean on a homeless girl had given way to admiration for both women's courage and wisdom. The reaction that had initially worried him had turned out to be the beginning of the most beautiful chapter in his family's story, a chapter that continued to unfold with love, success, and joy for all of them. The homeless girl had become a beloved daughter and sister, the lonely retiree had become a purposeful mentor and mother, and the concerned son had learned that sometimes the most surprising decisions turn out to be the wisest ones of all. Their story proved that family can be created through choice and love, and that the most meaningful relationships often begin in the most unexpected circumstances.